Good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for coming here today. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Brendan O'Leary, who's currently a visiting fellow at the Moore Institute, and is one of the preeminent political scientists of his generation. He's Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the most respected and influential scholars of conflict, of consociationalism and of power sharing. And I think one of the things that marks him out during a time when much social science writing has been stripped of passion, stripped of emotion, is that his writing is so lively, provocative, irreverent, and humorous. And he writes with huge energy in a very, very engaging way. Now, his academic contribution, which is recognised globally, is intertwined with a contribution in the political world that has been just as important. And he's been deeply involved in efforts to bring a stable or to create stable forms of government in deeply divided societies. And he's particularly deeply involved at the moment with the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq, about which we will hear more. But I want to say a few words about his contribution in Ireland. He published around the time and in the years before the Good Friday Agreement a series of books that really helped to lay the intellectual foundation for that agreement, and that hugely influenced public debate at the time. His ideas were also very influential at a practical level in informing structures of government, changes to policing. But apart from the contribution through his academic work, he also acted as advisor to two shadow Labour secretaries of state, Kevin McNamara and later Mo Mowlam, as she prepared to take over and play a crucial role in negotiation for the Good Friday Agreement. So his influence fed into that process both through his academic work and his work as a political advisor. He'll address today one of the most challenging questions for those concerned with political stability. How do you establish stable and sustainable, but also equitable structures for government in divided societies? He'll talk about two areas today that are of particular concern in Ireland, where we still have lots of debate about the legacy of conflict, but also where there is great interest and great debate about conflict in the Middle Eastern region in general. Both areas in which his contribution has been both academic and political and very influential. It's particularly appropriate that his talk today is part of the ethics initiative launched by President Michael D. Higgins, which is about contributing to public debate on issues of ethics in the area of the political and the social. I want to ask you to join with me now in giving a warm welcome to Professor Brendan O'Leary.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. With an introduction like that, I can only fail to live up to the expectations generated. Nevertheless, I'll try and do my best. I would like, first of all, to thank the University of Galway for the fellowship I've enjoyed since the beginning of July. I'd like to thank the President of the National University of Ireland at Galway. I'd like to thank the President, who can't be here, but under whose auspices I speak. And I'd also like to thank the Moore Institute and its founder, Professor Canny. So the subject matter is power sharing in deeply divided places. I'd like to emphasize that power sharing is best achieved through lots of food sharing and lots of drink sharing. If you want to remain slim, handsome, or beautiful in the case of the female part of the species, then don't do power sharing. Do conflict, do violence. It's much better for your fitness and probably certain kinds of health. As you'll see, the first photograph on the left is one that in my home we call Two Fat Irishmen. and that was taken in the US Senate in 2000. Going to Darfur, by contrast, is a good way of remaining slim because you're almost guaranteed to get some kind of food-related illness. But I digress. I'd like to begin with some personal observations about the field of power sharing. The first is that most people think that when you go abroad, you want to promote your own country's system. So that Americans export the American Constitution, the French export the French Constitution, the British export, they don't have a constitution. What about the Irish? Well, we too are accused of exporting our particular successes associated with the Good Friday Agreement. But in my experience, what experts do when they go abroad is not to promote their own country's model, but rather to promote what they would like to have happened in their own country. So it's not the case that we have a battle between competing versions of national cultures abroad, but rather people are trying to experiment, often mistakenly, with foreign peoples, with idealized models of what they'd like to implement in their own countries. Sensible power sharing advice has to be contextual. It can't be based on seeking to export some idealized version of your own country. The second thing that I've noticed is that cosmopolitans have very, very typical biases. Typically, a cosmopolitan is a person with a passport in their pocket, somebody completely devoid of national, linguistic, religious, or ethnic prejudice, can't really understand why the locals are sunk in periodic battles of an antagonistic nature. And they presuppose that it's relatively easy to establish an integrated state based on equal citizenship. This is very clear if you've ever been in the Balkans, where for many years various European cosmopolitans have governed Bosnia and Herzegovina and have governed Kosovo with very little local sensitivity. If you take seriously the aspirations of those in conflict, particularly minorities, you will rarely find that what they're struggling for is to achieve a nation state based on equality of all citizens. That's rarely the case. Instead, they're minimally seeking autonomy, they're maximally seeking independence, their own nation state rather than an integrated one. Usually, minorities and their leaders are backward-looking. They're not the creatures modelled in political science, forward-looking, rational actors who don't display any recognition of sunk costs. Instead, they're invariably driven by some conception of their local, particularly their local ethnic history. So Darfuris are deeply driven by the fact that there used to be a Darfur Sultanate, and many of them want to recreate it, no matter how apparently irrelevant that regime might appear to the contemporary modern. The third thing I'd like to observe is the weaknesses of my own discipline, political science, and the social sciences generally. A lot of work has now been done on power sharing that is of a statistical nature. I'm going to briefly discuss some of that today. But very little of that literature has purchase. If you're trying to persuade a politician of the merits of a particular way of organizing the executive, or a political party that its interests are in a particular kind of electoral system, you can't do it through statistics. You have to use the telling anecdote, the telling episode from experience. The skills of a journalist are usually more useful than the skills of a social scientist. Two more things as personal observations. One is power sharing. I've had a job with a ridiculously long title. I was the United Nations Senior Advisor on Power Sharing for the Mediation Support Unit of the Department of Political Affairs of the United Nations. The only thing I can tell you about that title is that the longer your title is, the less important you are. If you're powerful, you have a nice, short, snappy title, President, Taoiseach, something like that. But when you have that position, people presuppose that your skills are pertinent everywhere. And in the United Nations, there is a temptation to believe that every crisis is best resolved through power sharing. And this has led to some recently absurd and utterly inappropriate use of power sharing. So when an African president loses an election and steals it and tries to stay in power, the solution often proposed is that there should be a power-sharing settlement with the person who actually won the election. This I call pseudo-power sharing. It's a very frequent recipe used by diplomats to try and resolve crises of executive formation. It doesn't do power sharing any good as an institutional prescription if it is seen to be rewarding the loser in an electoral competition. The last personal observation I'd like to make before getting to the academic core of my argument is that it's absolutely vital when looking at a group's preferences not to take what they overtly say at any given time as binding. And that may seem trite and obvious, but it's fundamentally important. A group's preferences are frequently strategic. They're conditioned by history, they're conditioned by all sorts of conceptions about what is or is not possible. And it's vital to understand this because you have to understand that the groups that they're in competition with will have very different conceptions of what the rock-bottom preferences of the other group are. We can see this in the history of our own island, that nationalists are always suspicious of unionists' fundamental preferences. They see them as a fundamentally settler colonial community with the desire permanently to lord it over the natives. And by contrast, they see nationalists as always intent on driving them into the sea. And those bottom-level fears about the other group's preferences are what you critically have to pay attention to. I once had the experience of giving advice in Kyrgyzstan. I'm probably the only person in the room who really knows the difference between Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Kurdistan. And the difference is that in Kyrgyzstan, you drink unpasteurized horse's milk. In Kazakhstan, you drink pasteurized horse's milk. And in Kurdistan, you don't drink horse's milk. There you are. An elementary lesson in Central Asian geography. But anyway, I was in Kyrgyzstan, and the very interesting feature of Kyrgyzstan was that the Uzbek population, which had recently been subjected to a pogrom, this was in 2010, constantly told international visitors on public occasions that what they wanted in Kyrgyzstan was a simple civic state based on equality. But when you talk to them in private, of course they wanted their own language, they wanted autonomy for the Uzbek community. They were fearful, terrified in fact, of expressing their overt public preferences. So these are things you have to bear in mind in the interpretation of group preferences. So, power sharing, the theme of this evening. Why should anybody want power sharing? The first and most obvious reason is to prevent war. The statistics on war since the Congress of Vienna of 1815 are now very clear. Three numbers are very easy to remember: 1/5, 1/2, and 3/4. 1/5 of the wars in the world since 1815 can be coded as national liberation wars or nationalist wars of some kind, based either on the demand for independence or autonomy. 1/2 of the wars between the Treaty of Versailles and the collapse of the Soviet Union were nationalist or ethno-national in character. But since 1991, 3/4 of the war have been ethno-national in character. And it's fairly obvious that if we break down the human race by category, linguistic, ethnic, national, or religious, there's a limit to the number of plausible nation states that could exist in the world. If we take each of those dimensions, possibly there's potential room for 8,000 nation states in the world. That isn't going to happen. That simply means that in lots of cases, power sharing has to be at least considered as an alternative to the standard arrangements of the nation state. This graphic, which you're not expected to be able to read, because after all, it's difficult to read it. It shows all the conflicts in the world since 1945, in which there have been over 1,000 battle deaths. Where does this come? Yes. This is the graph I wanted to focus on. You'll see that since 1945, the scale of human deaths in wars has actually, in general, gone down. There's been an uptick in recent times, and obviously because of the wars in Syria and Iraq, we can expect that to go up even further. Most of those wars are now internal civil wars. It's rare to have a formal war between two rival sets of governments in neighbouring sovereign states. The norm is an internal civil war, which is what power sharing is presumably supposed to address. The second reason to have power sharing is that most conflicts do not end in a military victory. Only about 1 in 10 will, in fact less than that, will end in a military victory. Most conflicts end with peace agreements of some kind, but usually imperfect ones. So power sharing has a role to play in the successful conclusion of wars, internal wars, and successful conclusion of peace agreements. This may seem blindingly obvious, but in fact, one of the most unfortunate features of my profession is that typically we're asked to get involved just as a war is starting. That's not the appropriate time. Got no useful military advice to give. The best role for power sharing occurs when the combatants, for various reasons, have decided that they're not going to accomplish a comprehensive victory. Then there's some possibility that we might matter. We also might matter before a conflict begins, but rarely in the opening moments are we useful. That's why the United Nations model of having a standby team to deal with conflict is in many ways radically inappropriate. That grouping is only useful towards the end of a conflict or to prevent one from materializing. It's very rarely useful at the very beginning of a conflict. The third reason to be interested in power sharing is because the alternatives for at least one group are usually worse. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see one way in which national and ethnic differences can be resolved, namely by elimination. We can exterminate people, genocide, we can expel them, ethnic expulsion, sometimes dignified with the phrase ethnic cleansing. We can partition territories to make entities allegedly more homogeneous than they were before in the hope that this will minimize conflict. We can make everybody like one another, literally like one another in the sense of resembling one another as an act of public coercion, rarely successful. Or we can go for the recipe of the integrated nation state in which all citizens are to be equal and cultural differences are to be in the private domain. In all of these strategies, it's usually the case that one group is going to lose in some fundamental sense. On the right-hand side of the screen are ways of managing ethnic and national differences. Most frequently, it's still the case that these are managed in a hierarchical way, in which one group or coalition of groups organizes itself and disorganizes others. That's the norm in imperial political systems and their successors in many parts of the world in which you have a dominant majority which disorganizes a minority community. Arbitration mechanisms in which an outside force or a third party regulate differences between groups is increasingly difficult. It used to be possible under monarchical systems because the monarch could be related to every community within the empire by dynastic marriage, for example. We've had cases in recent times in West Africa where particular leaders have been related to large numbers of ethnic groups in the country. That kind of bondage through marriage or lineage isn't possible in the modern world. So systems of arbitration are likely to be temporary and not likely to be enduring. In consequence, I think frequently in the presence of conflict, we are required to think about power sharing systems, and these come fundamentally in three packages: federal packages, consociational packages, which I'll explain in a moment, and centripetal packages. Those are packages intended to ensure that power sharing takes place on the basis of the cooperation of moderates. Rarely successful. So rarely is it successful that I'm not going to spend any significant time on it today. The fourth reason to be interested in power sharing, if you're an optimist, is that it seems to be increasing in incidence. This is data taken from my friend Lars Erik Siederman, who's a professor in Switzerland. He has shown that the numbers of humans living under governments which exclude their community from any significant participation in political power are falling. And the numbers of those in formal power-sharing systems of some kind are rising. Though obviously, given the trends you can see in these graphics, one shouldn't place too strong hopes in the idea that power sharing is necessarily the wave of the future. Large numbers of people live in systems in which their representatives, their communities remain significantly excluded from power. So what then is power sharing? The easiest way to define it is as the opposite of systems of power monopolization. Power sharing necessarily involves some organized system of exchanges of power and influence so that at least somebody is better off than before, and preferably all gain some improvement in their position. So we might define power sharing as all political arrangements that prevent one agent or one collectivity from being the winner who holds all critical power. So defined, power sharing obviously has both negative and positive connotations. The negative connotations are such systems are typically accused of leading to deadlock, leading to dysfunctionality, leading to stalemates in political confrontation. The positive sides of power sharing are consensus and unanimity. This, of course, I think is helpful because any definition that doesn't automatically load you in favor of power sharing in advance is a more neutral and therefore a more appropriately scientific definition. So the way in which I'm going to conceptualize power sharing from here on, and I'd be happy to take critical questions afterwards, is that power sharing is any set of arrangements of political institutions to prevent the monopoly, permanent or temporary, of executive, legislative, judicial, bureaucratic, security, or cultural power. And I emphasize cultural power because most contemporary power-sharing systems are designed to deal with cultural clashes over the definition of the nation, over matters of language, matters of religion, or alleged or real ethnicity. Cultural contestation is a very significant feature of contemporary conflict. So having defined power sharing in that way, it's quite easy to see that there are, broadly speaking, 5 major political patterns of power sharing. Between states, you can have international organizations and confederations. Among nations, you can have multinational states, typically multinational confederations or federations, sometimes consociations. Among peoples or communities that are intermixed, and here typically the arrangements will be consociational. Each group will get to govern its own culture, even in the presence of other people exercising theirs. So you will have different people going to different schooling systems within the same territorial space. They'll have their own media, they'll have their own forms of cultural self-government. And lastly, and very typically in Western democracies, you can have power sharing across political parties. All of these modes of power sharing are important. Sometimes they're found in interesting permutations. What they have in common is a set of instruments that are used to achieve power sharing. The key political bodies always have a formula. That formula involves some form of shared rule, some institutions in which decisions are made together, and some form of self-rule, some form of autonomy where the group makes the decisions on its own with its own leaders. The essence of all of these political arrangements can be summed up in a simple formula, PPA. Parity, equality of the groups, proportionality, each has influence in proportion to its numbers, and lastly, autonomy. Note that those principles don't easily fit together. If groups are to be equal, and yet the principle of proportionality is to apply, that sets up an immediate clash between a consensual rule in which all have equal rights and a proportional rule which would suggest that the larger group or groups would have more influence than the smaller ones. Power sharing does not guarantee the absence of clash or antagonism. Secondly, to achieve power sharing, you need security institutions that will underpin those political bodies. Armies, police services, intelligence agencies have to be organized in some way that makes those political power sharing institutions work well together. Thirdly, power sharing usually is associated with certain kinds of economic formulae. Those can be based on parity, proportionality, and autonomy. We'll divide the cake equally, we'll divide it according to per capita formulae, we'll allow each group to use its own share of natural resources to manage it as it seems fit. And lastly, you always have policies to promote and preserve cultural pluralism. And that's something I want to emphasize here because there are many fears among particularly Irish people that power sharing involves the entrenchment of previously existing cultures, when many people think that those particular cultures are partly responsible for conflict in the first place. Why should you support power sharing if it's going to entrench those negative and antagonistic cultures? Now, I think it's very important to understand that at the heart of most contemporary power sharing systems, there's a bargain. Each group is not making a commitment to freeze its culture and to freeze and protect the other group's culture. Instead, at the heart of power sharing bargains is the idea that each group is to be responsible for any transformations in its own culture. It's not going to be imposed by the other group. The core of the bargain is the idea that each group is autonomous in its own domain. It's not that Catholics have to remain 19th century papalists. It's not that Northern Irish Presbyterians have to remain committed to 17th century conceptions of the Scottish Covenant. It's rather that each group is free to develop, express, articulate, and change its own culture, provided, of course, that's compatible with the maintenance of the other group's culture. So this notion that power sharing necessarily involves a commitment to freezing tradition is, I think, simply false. So, to sum up this part of the argument, this should, of course, all be blindingly obvious, and if it isn't, then I've achieved something. Power sharing is promoted in order to end war, to prevent genocide and similar crimes against humanity, to control the violence of states so that states work for the security of all, not just the dominant ethnic group, and to enable group regulation of cultural change. That's what power sharing is, in my understanding, and I'd now like to defend it and then ask the question, does it work? And under what circumstances does it work? And then I'm going to close with considering the circumstances under which it might break down. One reason for defending power sharing is that it makes up for two core gaps in the Western political tradition. The Western political tradition is deeply committed to the idea that constitutionality is the secret of political stability. It's also deeply committed to the idea that democracy settles most forms of human conflict in relatively amicable ways. Power sharing makes up, in my view, for the deficiency of both constitutionalism and democracy. Constitutionalism is not sufficient because constitutions can very easily entrench dominant power. You can have very powerful executives, single-person presidencies, single-person prime ministers. You can have emergency powers that can quite easily be manipulated and abused by the incumbent in power, as has happened in Iraq under the premiership of Nouri al-Maliki. So nothing about constitutionalism per se guarantees that checks and balances will successfully work to prevent both permanent and temporary monopolies of power. So constitutionalism per se is insufficient, though, of course, power sharing can be constitutionally entrenched. Power sharing is also not quite the same thing as the idea of the separation of powers. One of the amusing things about being in negotiations involving Arabic-speaking populations, I've had this experience both in negotiations about Darfur, in Doha, in Qatar, and also in Iraq. One of the interesting problems we had was that we would translate everything from English into Arabic, and then we would make sure that the translation from Arabic back into English was done by somebody else to ensure that we were always getting the correct formulae across. And we would do this with other linguistic groups as well. But in Arabic, this problem constantly recurred. Every time power sharing was written down in English and translated into Arabic, the translation we would get back into English was the separation of powers. Now, the two notions are distinct. To separate powers, such as executive, legislative, and judicial powers, implies that you're trying to tackle monopoly by fragmentation. It deliberately ensures that there isn't one body wholly in charge of coordinating public policy or law. It has many merits in tackling monopoly. But if each of the key institutions that is separated by the separation of powers is dominated by one group, one language group, one religious group, one ethnic group, then the accomplishment of the division of powers has no benefits for minorities except under highly ideal circumstances. Power sharing, by contrast, requires conscious coordination of policy and law by groups that self-consciously are organized as groups to be represented as groups in key institutions. It is compatible with the institutional separation of powers, but it's not quite the same idea. Democracy is plainly not enough for dealing with many of the conflicts in the world for reasons that we in Ireland are very familiar with. Democracy can quite quickly be a system of majority tyranny. And the competition for power, though it can check certain kinds of abuses, can quite quickly degenerate into politics as a census, where we simply measure group size. And it can quite quickly lead to possibilities of violent conflict, particularly at the formation of democratic systems. One of the paradoxes of the contemporary world is that we promote democracy to achieve better systems for people, and in the hope that democracies will be more peaceful with one another. But the paradox is that the process of democratization itself, partly because it very likely will set in place competition between ethnic groups, between linguistic groups and religious groups, will generate violence. So that's why power sharing has to be considered as sometimes an appropriate formula for assisting democratization. So I've indicated what I think power sharing is, or how it should be understood. Now I'm going to ask the question, does it work? Which is, after all, a very fair question. Here, typically, we have a war of anecdotes. For every successful case people can think of, Canada, Belgium, if you think Belgium is a success story, the European Union, Switzerland, for every case like that, people can quite quickly think of a country case, a Soviet Union, a Yugoslavia, a Bosnia and Herzegovina, a contemporary Iraq. How do we come to a reasonable assessment about whether power sharing can actually work? After all, if power sharing appears to collapse in a particular case, it may not be because power sharing was impossible, but rather people chose the wrong power sharing formulae for their particular conditions. That could be the problem. So in Northern Ireland in 1973-74, we had a power sharing settlement, which we all know today as the Sunningdale Settlement. It collapsed under a loyalist workers' general strike. It collapsed partly because it wasn't supported by the then incumbent Labour government in the UK. It collapsed for a whole series of reasons. But did it collapse because its design was inappropriate? That's a key question that analysts of power sharing have to address. In my field, there are now a whole range of statistical studies of power sharing, which are basically devoted to the question of assessing whether, on average, power sharing systems can be successful. And I'm delighted to note, and otherwise the purpose of this lecture would be odious, that the results are positive. To begin with, Arend Leipart, a famous Dutch scholar who's the pioneering conceiver of the theory of consociation, that is the theory of how power sharing can work to ensure that you have cross-community executive power sharing, proportionality of group representation in key institutions, self-government, and veto rights. He calls that collective package consociation. Arend Leipart has tested all the stable democracies of any significant size over the last 3 decades. And what he shows is that the more a democracy has power-sharing features, consensual multi-party government, checks and balances that prevent the domination of or exploitation or maltreatment of minority groups, and so on, these kinds of democracies consistently outperform the winner-takes-all majoritarian kind of democracies. And not only do they outperform them in ways that we might consider important in conventional terms, high levels of employment, high levels of price stability, high levels of growth, but they also outperform on what are sometimes called soft standards. Better protection of women's rights, better protection of human rights in general, and better welfare entrenchment. Now, you might think that these results are significantly biased by the presence of large numbers of West European multi-party systems in the data set. But that actually isn't the case, though they are obviously significantly like that. So what Leipart's results show is that within democracies, the democracies that are more power-sharing in nature perform better. What about worldwide, beyond the stable democracies? Pippa Norris, a professor at Harvard, has looked worldwide at all regimes, and using a different understanding of power sharing, but with a primary focus on proportional representation, parliamentary systems, and the existence of federal or decentralized institutions, she argues that even in non-democratic systems, if you have power-sharing features inside those authoritarian regimes will outperform other authoritarian regimes. This is not a recommendation, of course, for creating authoritarian regimes everywhere, just in case you thought it was, but it is an interesting feature of her data set that it appears to be the case that the presence of these kinds of institutions has an independent impact on all sorts of important criteria that we would want to assess governments by: conflict avoidance, economic development, the avoidance of corruption. So Leipart shows you that power sharing gives you a better democracy with better outcomes. Norris shows us that with power sharing attributes, even authoritarian regimes will perform better than their counterparts that don't have these attributes. But what about war and conflict itself? Several studies, I highlight merely one here on the slide, show us that if you adopt power-sharing institutions in conjunction with intelligent security arrangements to end a conflict, then you're much less likely to have a recurrence of war afterwards. So Michaela Mattis and Berku Savin have shown, looking at 46 major civil wars which ended with a peace agreement, that in those agreements in which they successfully incorporated power-sharing arrangements, in particular power-sharing arrangements which ensured parity between the groups after the Civil War, and which ensured the proportional representation of those groups in key institutions, there was a very significantly lower likelihood of the recurrence of conflict. So it would appear, statistically across the planet, we can say power sharing gives you a better democracy, power sharing gives you a better regime, whatever your regime type, and power sharing makes war recurrence less likely. These are comforting conclusions, but obviously I wouldn't want to have you believed that you should rely totally on them? After all, they are the results of political science, and political science isn't really very high in the status hierarchy of the sciences. And lots of these results are the result of different definitions of power sharing, different statistical tests, and consequently, though these results are robust, and I haven't been selective in what I've been telling you, one should be cautious about having total confidence in these arguments. Nevertheless, I think we're allowed to conclude that if you want to lower violence, if you want better democratic standards, it's advisable to consider power sharing arrangements, especially if you've recently had a violent or protracted conflict. So if that's right, the informed debate should be about how and why power sharing works, what particular types of power sharing are best for given conditions, when we should intervene to promote power sharing, if at all, whether that intervention should be high or low from the point of view of international and regional organizations, and of course, critically, when is power sharing most likely to be successful? These, I think, are the reasonable arguments. So if you hear skeptics saying that power sharing never works, that's obviously false. The simple bottom line conclusion I can give you is that it sometimes works. And it sometimes works across all of those three dimensions. Improvement under any kind of regime, improvement of your democracy, and improvement of your likelihood of avoiding conflict recurrence. So let me deal with the two cases I promised you, Iraq and Northern Ireland. These are not typically compared. And I'm not trying to suggest to you that these should be typically compared. There are major differences between these places. Iraq has a very large population. Northern Ireland does not. Conflict in Iraq is largely triangular. There are three major communities with rival visions for the future of Iraq, or indeed to have no Iraq in the case of the Kurds. Each of those three communities is internally divided. Likewise, in Northern Ireland, although you have a central dualistic conflict between nationalists and unionists, there are divisions among nationalists and unionists, and there are those who claim to be neither. So the configuration is different, but the fundamental contrast is between a trilateral conflict and a bilateral conflict. The neighbourhoods are very different. No matter how antagonistic we Irish may occasionally feel about the British, they are democratic, they're our neighbour, they're in the European Union. Relations between Britain and Ireland are generally positive, benign, and not characterised by hyper-suspicion or recent deep military conflict. That's not the case in Iraq. Iraq has 5 authoritarian neighbours, one of which is currently undergoing a profound civil war. Iraq has invaded 2 of its neighbours in recent times, and one of its neighbours, 2 of its neighbours, Turkey and Iran, have invaded portions of it. So the neighbourhood of Iraq is much less auspicious, and it's a general result of studies of democracies that the better your neighbourhood, the better your prospects of stable democratisation. So Iraq's chances were always lower than Northern Ireland's. In both places, you do have formally dominant minorities. Ulster Unionists were part of the dominant minority that prevailed in much of Ireland between the 17th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Sunni Arabs dominated Iraq throughout Ottoman times and in spaces that later became Iraq, and they dominated Iraq under the British Mandate, under the Iraqi monarchy, and under the First Iraqi Republic, and indeed under the Baathists and Saddam Hussein's regime. They're now displaced from power. The psychology of formally dominant minorities is rarely accommodating. Their usual aspiration is to accomplish a restoration of power as quickly as possible. In Iraq, you have a very clear Shiite demographic and electoral majority that the American intervention has now permitted to achieve power through the ballot box. That's a complete reversal of relationships inside the Arab community. In Northern Ireland, Ulster Protestants have been removed from a position of dominance to roughly a position of equality, partly as a result of demographic change. So that's a major difference. Iraq has officially religious parties as well as nationalist parties. They have religious names, they have explicit religious appeals. Now, you may not think this is true. You may think this is also true of Northern Ireland, but it's not. The Democratic Unionist Party, the Ulster Unionist Party, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, Sinn Féin, they all have secular titles. They all, in principle, appeal beyond a religious constituency. You may laugh about the extent to which they do so successfully, or you may be sceptical or cynical, but the fact is that they're formally nationalist or unionist parties. By contrast, in Iraq, religion is directly in the public domain, as well as questions of nationality. And lastly, of course, the territorial concentrations of the group vary significantly. In Iraq, the three major constituencies are largely geographically distinct, allowing for the possibility of a federal or confederal settlement. Whereas in Northern Ireland, though you do have significant territorial concentration, you do have also lots of mixed zones where groups are, if not cheek by jowl, at least close to one another. But nevertheless, both of these places have had power-sharing experiments. Iraq's has gone badly, Northern Ireland's has gone remarkably well. Each of them can be understood as, in different ways, embedding the principles I referred to earlier: parity, proportionality, autonomy, and veto rights. In Iraq, in the Constitution of 2005, it was formally declared a multinational state. Kurds and Arabs were declared equal as nations and equal as linguistic communities. Iraq originally had a collective presidency in which 3 persons were returned to office, representing the 3 major communities of Iraq. Not by law, they didn't have to be a Kurd, a Sunni Arab, and a Shia, but they were. That's how they organized their votes. In Iraq, you've had list proportional representation determining elections. Precisely because of that, the Shia have not been one bloc and have invariably needed to build coalitions in order to return a new federal prime minister and a new council of ministers to office. Iraqis agreed that revenues from previously exploited oil fields would be proportionally allocated across Iraq on a per capita formula that's embedded in the constitution. The autonomy granted in Iraq, according to the Constitution, is dramatic. If you read Article 110 of Iraq's Constitution, it gives the federal government the shortest list of powers of any federal government in the 20th or the 19th centuries. The bulk of powers are reserved to regions or provinces. Veto rights are built into the Iraqi system. Originally, the 3 presidents each had a veto right over law or public policy, but that was a transitional arrangement phased out in 2010. But significantly, each region, Kurdistan is so far the only region, but the provinces are entitled to become regions, each region has the right to nullify, to say no, this federal law does not apply in this region, or to modify it in any way that they see fit, as long as the relevant area of law or policy is outside the very small number of powers which are exclusively those of the federal government. So Iraq has a comprehensive power-sharing settlement, which hasn't worked. Northern Ireland also has one, and it has worked. You have the equality of the 2 first ministers. You have a cabinet based according to the rule of proportionality by the D'Hondt rule, which I'll explain briefly in a moment. Victor D'Hondt is, by the way, a very good answer if you have a problem. Some of you may be familiar with the game Trivial Pursuit. Have you ever played Trivial Pursuit? In Trivial Pursuit, there is a challenge. The challenge is, name a famous Belgian. Most people fail this challenge miserably unless they're Belgian, because what they usually do is name a 17th century Flemish painter, when the problem is Belgium didn't exist. So, apart from those who mentioned Tintin, who isn't a real character, I have a solution for you. Victor de Hont. He's a famous Belgian. A very famous Belgian who designed the electoral system which fundamentally shapes many European democracies and indeed shapes the way in which committee chairs and positions are shared out in the European Parliament. And that is the system that Northern Ireland has adapted for the formation of its cabinet. Northern Ireland also has, as a result of fair employment laws, affirmative action in the private and the public sectors. So the principle of proportionality applies in public and private employment. Northern Ireland also has autonomy. Both the autonomy of Northern Ireland from Westminster, now extended to include policing and judicial powers, but also autonomy in, and fundamentally, schooling arrangements. Each system, each constituent community has its own schooling system, funded on a per capita basis equally, and funded on a capital basis also equally since 1992. And Northern Ireland famously has a set of veto arrangements. So both countries embed power-sharing formulae. The Iraqi experience has not been a success, to put it mildly. The Northern Ireland one has been a dramatic success. It's still fragile, but it has been a dramatic success. So we should ask ourselves, why has Northern Ireland been more functional than Iraq? Now, you could say I've already answered the question, the neighbourhood, and all those other variables that I referred to. But I don't think those are sufficient to account for the differences between the cases. I think Northern Ireland is aided very significantly by the fact that it's not sovereign, so that many of the fundamental questions of identity and external relations do not actually burden the local decision makers. The British and the Irish states regulate the most intense conflict that could occur within Northern Ireland. The budget is decided, the size of the budget is decided by the UK. Key questions are mediated by the British and Irish governments, who so far have not been characterised by having the negative relationships that existed certainly at previous points in our history. Security has been remarkably successfully transformed in Northern Ireland to create a police force which now has cultural Catholics between 30 and 35% of the force in less than 10 years is a remarkable outcome. And although no one would idealise that police force, it's a significantly different set of relations between the minority community and the police to that which existed previously. But I would suggest to you that the fundamental difference between the cases is that Northern Ireland has learned from its previous power-sharing experiments. Its latest one rectifies the errors of previous arrangements. In Northern Ireland, if you don't participate in the executive, you exclude yourself. Nobody seeks to institutionally exclude you, or at least the rules don't allow that to happen. Anybody with a mandate gets into government. There's not an attempt to build an inclusive, a coalition of moderates that then exclude hardliners. To the contrary, hardliners, provided they're willing to abide by democratic rules, are openly admitted into the system. The way in which Northern Ireland is now organised is in some senses, the exact opposite of what was tried in 73-74. On that occasion, quite deliberately, people tried to build a coalition of the moderate unionists and the moderate nationalists against Republicans and loyalists. And the centre did not hold, to put it mildly. After 98, we have a world in which there is a comprehensive coalition. And indeed, the system is driven from the flanks by the previously most hardline parties who have moderated their platforms. So the Northern Ireland case is a case of learning a better power-sharing system, something that Iraq obviously desperately requires to do in some analogous way. It's not clear that it will be able to do it. If we look from a height of 30,000 meters at both cases, we might say that in Iraq there's been far too little power sharing in Baghdad. The federal government has become totally dominated by its prime minister, and there has been no attempt to build the autonomy and self-government of the provinces or governorates of Arab Iraq. The case of Northern Ireland, we might say, looking again from a very high point of view, that there's too much power sharing in Belfast. Lots of questions don't have to be resolved in principle by the Northern Ireland Assembly. They could be settled at a more local level. There's no reason why all the questions attached to policing and parades should be organised at Northern Ireland level. They could perhaps be successfully delegated at another level. So it's possible to see in both cases that a reassignment of powers might produce some greater stability. But if we look at their geographies, I think we can clearly see huge and key differences between the cases. If we look at Iraq and you ignore the desert zones in white, there's a clear separation of the three communities in most places. The most violent clashes occur in Baghdad, which still remains mixed, but has now an increasingly diminished Sunni Arab minority. And on the borders between Kurdistan and Arab Iraq, there are a range of mixed cities and towns and villages where you have heterogeneity that you don't find elsewhere. In Iraq, the primary need for successful power sharing is at the city level in places like Kirkuk, Baghdad, and Mosul, not perhaps so centrally important in the country as a whole, provided it can develop a federal system. So consociational arrangements in Iraq need to work at the city level less than they need to work in the country as a whole, though they are applicable there as well. If we look at Iraq's internal divisions, at the moment, they're partially productive for power sharing. No group is homogeneous. Each group is internally divided. To create a federal coalition that will be lasting, the new Prime Minister has to build a coalition beyond his own Shiite constituency. It's not at all clear that he can do that, but the fact that he does not preside over a unified Shiite bloc actually makes that more likely than it might otherwise be. Those are reasons to be mildly, very mildly cheerful about Iraq's prospects, but I don't want to overemphasize them. In Northern Ireland, we've seen greater territorial segregation taking place. And as a result of the new organisation of local government arrangements in Northern Ireland, we have a reduced number of local governments and reduced political competition in consequence. On the left-hand side of the board, I've indicated the new local governments that are going to be dominated by nationalists come what may for the next decade at least. On the right are the ones dominated by unionists, and again, likely to be that way for the decade ahead. The only place where there is significant competition for power is in Belfast itself, where there is a nationalist plurality, but if the others split with unionists on key questions, the city doesn't have a unionist majority. So what this means is that a lot of the power sharing questions in Northern Ireland now centrally focus on the Belfast region. They don't have to be so important everywhere else, where majority rule and some inclusion of the minority can, in effect, do a lot of the significant exchanges and bargaining between the groups. Belfast is the epicenter of the disputes over flags. Belfast is the epicenter of most of the disputes over parading. It's not the sole locus, but it's the key locus. So in Belfast, power sharing questions remain vital. And I think one of the reasons for the certain small tremors in conflict in the north can be explained by the fact that Belfast was the only major location in which power sharing had not been practiced at the local government level before it became system-wide after 1998. All of the other local governments with significant nationalist populations had shifted to a power sharing system before 1998. Belfast was the key and distinct exception. Okay, let me conclude. What brings power sharing systems down? They're obviously likely to be vulnerable. They're open to the challenge that they're not democratic. They require all sorts of cooperation from groups that are fundamentally in antagonism. So it's not difficult to see why they can be precarious. But I want to suggest to you that in examining why they break down, you should focus mostly on the larger or the dominant group, not on the potential secessionists or the minorities. And the ways in which this can happen are various, but they can be reduced to three. Where the dominant group seeks to rule by majority rule, then it's threatening system breakdown. Even nice people like the Czechs managed to do this. They said to the Slovaks, majority rule means that we'll have a liberal economy and your heavy industries will go. Majority rule means we'll have a more centralized and rational economic set of arrangements, and that means you'll suffer, but in the end, you'll do well, little brothers. It led to the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Recentralization of power is a frequent trigger for the breakdown of federations and confederations. Most people think that the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia broke up as a result of large-scale secessionist movements. And that, of course, was the final outcome. But what they typically forget is the immediate precursor to breakup in both cases was the unsuccessful attempt to re-centralize both systems. In Yugoslavia, it was more visibly evident in the projects of Slobodan Milosevic, but it also happened in the Soviet Union. The immediate trigger for the collapse of the Soviet Union was a coup in which the hardliners attempted to unwind the decentralizing concessions that Gorbachev had just signed away in an all-union treaty. In Sudan, the fundamental feature of its history throughout the post-colonial period has been the breaking of power-sharing pacts and autonomy arrangements achieved with the South. So it's fundamentally the political competition for influence within the dominant or central group which is likely to trigger power-sharing breakdowns of a federal kind. Of course, one way in which dominant groups can dissolve power-sharing systems is to decide that they don't want the periphery, to downsize, to basically expel places. You're not supposed to do this in international law, but international law doesn't explain how the world works. In the case of Malaysia, Singapore was in effect expelled from it, to the mutual long-run benefit of both places. So downsizing is a possible strategy adopted by dominant groups. What about the non-dominant? Secessionists have a very, very difficult time in succeeding anywhere. They need to be territorially concentrated. They need to have very significant unity among their population. And they have to have a combatant, a centre that is willing to be defeated in war, or at least willing to accept their eventual departure. And on top of that, they need to be able to achieve widespread recognition internationally, all of which is difficult. But all secessionist movements will nevertheless resist any effort on the part of a centre to re-centralize or to reimpose monopoly power. They can frequently be relied upon to renegotiate a settlement, but there's only so many times a marriage can be repaired. And that's the situation of the Kurds in contemporary Iraq. Most Kurdish politicians that I've spoken to recently, most of them who are very representative of their community, believe now is the moment to go. They don't believe any Baghdad promises. They've had a whole institutional history of treaties and agreements with Baghdad that have fundamentally been broken. They don't believe it's going to be any better this time around. But what I'd like to emphasize to you is that it's a group's assessment of its pivotality, its decisiveness, which may well be important in explaining its final collective decision-making over questions of power sharing and unity. In the case of the Kurds in 2005, they believed that they were likely to balance the Sunni and the Shia. They were significantly positioned between both of them, and they could therefore play a role in determining who had power in Baghdad. For that reason, they believed it was worth experimenting with a federal political system. By contrast, the South Sudanese in 2010 realized that their demographic size in Sudan was much less than they expected it to be after the first free census was held, and they came to the conclusion that they would never have sufficient pivotality or decisiveness in the Sudan, and in consequence they decided to secede. A final word, the formerly dominant minorities. In the case of Iraq, we can see that the Sunni Arabs are now switching their preferences. Their initial ambition was to reject the American settlement, both the federal dimension and the democratic dimension. But they've given up on that. They realize that if Iraq is to be remade, their best chance lies in federalizing their own provinces in the same manner as Kurdistan. Or they have taken the view, like ISIS, that they should, in effect, remake the entire political system of the region so that there is a Sunnistan, a space entirely dominated by Sunni Arabs. That could be the basis of remaking Iraq, that most of the Sunnis who are not jihadists have realized that the only way in which they can participate in Iraq is to imitate Kurdistan. If that works, if Kurdistan says, it's possible that you could have a balance of power within Iraq. In the case of unionism, unionists made a settlement in 1998 because their demographic status was diminishing, because they thought there was some prospect of a settlement that would protect them into the long run. What might tempt them to break the system? Only two things: fear of being outflanked on their right, in the case of the Democratic Unionist Party, by those who would imitate what the Democratic Unionist Party did to the Ulster Unionist Party previously. That makes them fearful electorally and makes them do things that they might otherwise not do, like compete vigorously on issues of flags, identity, the House report and matters like that. But they're also tempted intermittently when they think that they might be pivotal or decisive in the making of UK, United Kingdom, Westminster-based coalitions. That too can potentially destabilise Northern Ireland. I don't think that's going to happen, but these are potentially destabilising factors. Okay, let me conclude. I have said a lot of things. I have said many of them very, very quickly and flatly. I'm open to interrogation. As long as the interrogation respects the Irish Constitution, I'm very open to what you have to say. Thank you for listening to me.
So we'll take 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and who would like to start? Yes, at the back.
Well, there's a group of academics in Northern Ireland that have established a group called Archive, which proposes that both governments establish a commission made up of scholars to investigate the past. What are your views on that proposal?
I think that most of the people making that proposal, interestingly enough, are unionist people. And they seem to imagine that the science of history is always objective and impartial, and that provided they were given all the archival records, they would come up with an accurate story. I think it's highly implausible that that's exactly what would happen. I do think that there may well be a case for comprehensive inquiries of this kind into past atrocities by both militias, paramilitary groups, and the state. But to work in Northern Ireland, absolutely everybody would have to be on an equal footing. And there is absolutely no indication that a Westminster government is willing to put its intelligence services, the army, let alone the local police, through that kind of open process. So my own views on that matter, there is no successful formula for managing controversies over the past that I know of. There are ways in which you can bypass the difficulties. The one that appeals most to me is comprehensive amnesties all round, so that you can look forward. It avoids making a judgment on who was most culpable for conflict. People will differ over that for decades to come. But it does draw a line under the past and enables people to go forward. What's happening in Northern Ireland at present, in my view, is large-scale scab picking. And picking scabs is not actually a very good way to allow the body to heal. Do come back if you wish.
I tend to agree with your remarks that, I mean, it's historical sense is such that, as you say, we're still very close to the conflict. It's still very raw emotions, and scholars are no less close to that than the rest of us.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah, to what degree is the distribution of oil resources and proportion of this holding Iraq together? And could you give us a look at the Iraqi map to tell us where the oil resources are? And would it be in the interest of one group to segment and have all the oil to themselves?
I didn't send you these slides in advance, but I thought the question might come. So, just one moment. I can indeed answer your question. Sorry, this is the oil resources of the entire Middle East region. Let's focus here on Iraq. I'm deliberately showing you this one because this is an out-of-date map, and the out-of-date map is the one that tends to be in people's head, and it's the one that guides the way they act politically. So if you look at this, you see that Western Iraq appears to have no large oil fields. So you think, to put it crudely, that Sunni Arabs get the sand and the Quran, right? Whereas the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south, they get the oil, the sand, and the Quran if they want it. Okay? So many people, particularly American policymakers, argued you needed a centralized federation to ensure that the Sunnis would get their share. In the background was another American assumption: we need a centralized Iraq to balance against Iran. So we need a strong government in Baghdad, preferably led by a strongman. And yes, he's also supported by Iran. So why did we actually have this policy? But let's abstract from that for the moment. The truth is that Allah, in his infinite wisdom, has distributed oil deposits more or less everywhere in Iraq. So there's plenty inside Kurdistan now being developed, particularly around here. There's lots of oil deposits in Anbar, out in the west, predominantly Sunni. There are pockets of oil exploration that are showing signs of success north and west of Baghdad as well. So there's plenty of oil for the future, and there is significant oil available for Sunnis. The Constitution of 2005, I was an advisor to Kurdistan, we thought we had accomplished a brilliant success, and we thought it was very clear. Here was the deal. All of Iraq's oil exploited before 2005 was to be distributed across Iraq as a whole on a per capita basis. Everybody was to get an equal share, with some compensation for some past difficulties experienced by some regions, though that was never applied. The new oil, and it was also clear in the Constitution that the federal government owned no oil and no natural resources. We certainly succeeded in removing any provision that the federal government owned any oil. The Constitution of Iraq says that the oil and gas in Iraq is owned by all of the people of Iraq in all the regions and governorates. The media never ever mentioned the last clause, in all the regions and governorates. And the thinking there was to decentralize Iraq by ensuring that future oil revenues would be developed locally, oil would be developed locally and then distributed across Iraq as a whole in an agreed revenue sharing law. Now, what happened to prevent this settlement from working was many things. One was the American preference for centralization, so they ignored the Constitution. The second was the Shiite preference under the Dawa party for centralization, which ignored the Constitution. And the Americans focused on getting agreement on production arrangements, namely which companies would come in, how would they develop the oil that existed, instead of focusing first and primarily on what matters politically, getting an agreement on how the revenues are to be shared. So there has never been, since 2005, a new federal oil law governing either production or revenue. Instead, Kurdistan passed its own laws, which it's entitled to do under the Constitution, successfully attracted lots of small companies to develop oil, and is now in the business of trying to export them. And just before Maliki fell, he was preventing Kurdistan from having any of its oil revenues that it was entitled to as a result of the fields in production before 2005, and additionally not trying to block them from earning any revenues from their oil exports. So the very first demand that Kurdistan has on the negotiating table with the new Prime Minister is a restoration of all the budget cuts, which are unlawful, and then recognition of its independent production rights. So that's a kind of a factual resume. Could these three peoples distribute and share these revenues? Yes, they could. The geography does not tell against the interests of Sunni Arabs. And if the Sunni Arabs wisely now coalesce around trying to make their own provinces like Kurdistan, with some of the Shia who thought about that as their original model of a better Iraq, there could be the basis for a political settlement. I'm, however, skeptical, because I think that the internal divisions among the Sunnis are still high. The depths of the sectarian war between Sunni and Shia are so raw that they're unlikely to be able to come to the rational bargain that's available. What's stunning for all places there is that there's no need for the government to have any taxation. There's no income tax. There's no significant sales tax. Kurdistan has an emergency export tax now because it was deprived of revenues by Baghdad. So one of the problems for Iraq is a genuine oil curse, in the sense that there are no parliamentary institutions in which the politicians have to extract taxes from the population and deliver services in consequence. Instead, they have an enormous set of oil revenues which prevent them from any need for to tax their population. And the best and most vivid description of the government in Baghdad is that it's like the worst combination of Nigeria and Lebanon, namely huge, colossal corruption, in addition to deep sectarian conflict. Now, the scale of the corruption is unbelievable. It would appear that Maliki's family has extracted somewhere in the region of $45 billion. Billion. You know, Irish politicians are really unambitious. So, to bring this to a close, if there was constructive leadership, there's a basis for a rational settlement in which all could benefit. I just think it's improbable. That moment has passed. It could have occurred. The abuse of power by Maliki, the deepening of the Sunni-Shia division, the success of ISIS, all of this makes it highly unlikely that we'll get the kind of bargain that could work. Now, who knows for the long run?
I just want to point out as well, there's a roving mic if anybody needs it and asking questions. Do you want to come back on that?
Thank you. There's so many questions that come up from that talk. And with apologies to the President's initiative, one of the, I suppose, the attractions of this model in a way is it doesn't require an ethic of toleration anyway. And presumably you find your own interests satisfied by this kind of system of power sharing. You therefore don't have to participate in that kind of newly imagined set of relationships. But I wondered about two sort of general questions, and they might be relevant to Iraq or to the examples you discussed generally. One is this typically or always a kind of negative solution to a problem? Is it an outcome, therefore, of conflict in which you bargain by saying, look, this is the best we can do, we accept a negative? Is there a way in that sense of positively engaging this? This sounds more a little bit like the Canadian model of, look, this is a good. We embrace it as a good. And we adapt and we transform our political systems in order to imagine a future which is better and more just. That speaks to me maybe of a slightly different question, which is, to what extent is politics dependent on building a tradition? And how do you create a tradition out of something which hasn't been there before?
You've partly answered your own powerful and important question. So, power sharing systems that have come into being through past bargains and accommodations eventually will generate a positive celebration of those arrangements. So, with the exception of, a very important exception of key Quebec nationalists, Canada does conceive of itself as multinational, multicultural, multilingual. Indeed, it loves Quebec precisely because it stops Canada becoming another America. We love you so much, you keep us different. So there is a genuine celebration of difference. The same in a less clear way might be argued of Switzerland, and perhaps less evidently so of Belgium. It can certainly be argued of India, parts of India. But what I would say about ethics is this: power sharing demands an ethic of responsibility on the part of the leaderships that run this system. They must be sufficiently vigorous and assertive that they remain representative of their communities, and they must be able to make bargains and deals with the representatives of other communities, and they must limit their bargaining. There must be some careful avoidance of maximalism, because otherwise they will bring the system down. So an ethics of responsibility is certainly required of the leaders who run a power sharing system, but it's not required that the communities as a whole share some collective commitment to a celebration of their diverse differences. And I think if you came in the first place with a recommendation of cosmopolitan celebration of difference, you would have no impact whatsoever. Your job has to be to show people, if possible, that there are rational ways that they can make a bargain that would reflect and respect their core interests and identities. So building that, the Americans were amazing, and the British too in Iraq. I couldn't believe it. I was in Erbil in 2004. A Welsh woman stood up in front of 1,000 Kurdish women and said, "Just be Iraqis." There was total silence in the room. I put up my hand. I said, "I think you're Welsh." She said, "Yes." "Are you just British?" And the Kurds roared with laughter. Roared with laughter. So the Americans and the British said to everybody, "Just be Iraqi." In the most implausible conditions on earth in which people would want to be just Iraqi. The Kurds' post-genocidal assaults of Saddam Hussein. So if you want to build multiple identities and shared collective identities, don't do it that way. Get the bargain first, and maybe if you're lucky, things might emerge later.
A question here first, and then...
Just a brief word on how your view of how the power sharing structures in Bosnia and Herzegovina have operated up to now.
Good question. So, a nice comparison between Northern Ireland and Bosnia and Herzegovina is as follows. The arrangements in Bosnia and Herzegovina are corporate consociational. The three presidents have to be a Serb, they have to be a Croat, and they have to be a Bosniak. The decision-making rules entrench very vigorous vetoes. The system was designed to end a war. It had very little legitimacy among any of the constituents. And what's happened is that America, and then largely the European Union, governs Bosnia and Herzegovina as the impartial arbiter and unwinds as much of the settlement of 1995 as it can get away with. And it's used the European Court of Human Rights to do this as well, attacking the method of electing the presidency and the Senate. Now, I think of these two cases as very important for the thinking of Britain and Ireland and everybody in Northern Ireland. Let's imagine there are undesirable features of the Northern Ireland arrangements and you want to change them. I think it's vital that they be changed under the rules of the bargain previously agreed, and not changed by the action of some court or by some outside power, because there's no better way of destabilizing a power-sharing settlement than for some outside force to rattle the cages, invariably in a way that will benefit one group rather than another. So, in an ideal world, would I have created the arrangements that occurred in Dayton in 1995? No. But they have prevented a recurrence of war. And in my view, the major problem of Britain and France and Germany and Austria, the EU as a whole, and the United States, is that they've not allowed the partners inside Bosnia and Herzegovina to bear the costs of their own decisions. If they don't cooperate, then there are certain consequences from their lack of cooperation. They will have a less effective polity. Instead, what happens is that they're allowed to express their radical opposition to one another, and then in comes the arbiter from outside to make, quote unquote, the wise governance decision. So this generates an ethic of irresponsibility among the local politicians. It would be as if every time there was a disagreement in Northern Ireland, the British and Irish governments agreed to suspend the institutions. That, to me, is not the way forward. So Bosnia and Herzegovina is an example of an overly rigid power-sharing system, which is interfered with too much from the outside. So by comparison, what's in existence in the north is a lot better on multiple dimensions.
We'll just take a
There was a gentleman
couple more
here.
questions before we wind up. So I see one here and then a second question there. And a final question over here.
Slightly provocative, perhaps, but in democratic terms, when democracy should be about alternatives, isn't the best thing that can be said for power sharing is that it's better than what went before?
Yes and no, because in your head might be an idealized model of government and opposition that you have got as a result of the diffusion of the Westminster culture, which is very powerful in these islands. And that is one model of democracy. A well, it is the predominant model that then gives shape to other thinking about democracy. Most other democratic systems usually actually accomplish having a majority in power. The Westminster system doesn't even do that. It frequently gives power to a plurality. Now that's fine if everybody shares the same broad cultural dispositions. But once your society is significantly heterogeneous, it's a recipe for tyranny and disaster. So that government and opposition model I wouldn't idealize. Now, could you have more opposition in the Northern Ireland arrangements? Yes, but that simply requires those who are complaining about it, the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, to withdraw from participation in government and say to the electorate, expand our vote and make us the big players, and this is what we'll do instead. That's open to them. Nothing stops them from doing it. Right? There's no absolute requirement for people to participate in government. It does require representatives from each side to be in the government, but there's no requirement that that everybody from each side has to be in the system, which I see as a virtue.
I think my biggest issue is that it sometimes just feels infantilizing in Northern Ireland, the setup that's there. You know?
Yeah, I'd rather infantilism than war.
Absolutely, which is my point about better.
Okay.
At least it's better than what went before.
It is. Yeah, we agree on that. Good. Gentleman here.
What role, if any, do you think truth and reconciliation commissions or systems of transitional justice have in this sort of process?
You get a Truth and Reconciliation Commission typically when the regime is powerful enough to prevent its extinction and can bargain with the new forces that there will not be a comprehensive criminalization of the outgoing regime. When you get a revolution and the incumbent government is overthrown, very often the revolutionaries put everybody in the old regime before the courts and sentence them accordingly. In Northern Ireland, the British state did not collapse. It's not going to, in my view, allow itself to be the subject of a comprehensive inquiry and interrogation. That's why I earlier indicated that I would much prefer to see comprehensive amnesties. And almost, Nicholas knows about this from history. It used to be the case in Ireland that acts of oblivion were passed. That was the name, Act of Oblivion. And in a way, that's what I would like to see in Northern Ireland, an Act of Oblivion. Now, these formulae, Acts of Oblivion, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, application of the rule of law, whatever the legal system was, no impunity. So these are different formulae. None of them is perfect. What I would happily say is that if the parties agree on one of these formulae, they should stick to it. The Northern Ireland Agreement was very messy on these questions. So there was an implied but undeclared amnesty for the state. There was an amnesty for those organizations that participated in ceasefires and the eventual decommissioning of their weapons. But big hole was left. Past crimes were open to investigation on all sides. So that's a messy formula. Why is it like that? Because the parties couldn't agree. and they still can't agree. So I do not stand before you and say that I know that there is one formula for these questions that works best everywhere. The political scientist in me tells me that what will happen will be dictated by whether or not the incumbent regime has fallen. In this case, it hasn't. Therefore, you can't expect a comprehensive accounting of everybody. And therefore, in my view, it would be better to go for general amnesty.
So one final
It's more than a question and a comment. Just very directly, is power sharing an end or is it a route to an end? I suspect that many people down here, certainly I felt it was great in Northern Ireland, this was a route to an ultimate solution. And I have a sense from what you were saying that may not be the case.
It's both.
Yeah.
There are various types of power sharing arrangements which are clearly transitional. So in South Africa, they agreed a transitional power sharing formula to a set of universal suffrage elections, and they agreed rules under which a new constitution would be created. And the Afrikaners made an error. They thought they would do slightly better, and they underestimated how well the ANC would do, and therefore they ended up having a more majoritarian outcome than they had anticipated. So one of the reasons for that was that the ANC was never going to sign up before those first elections to an entrenched power sharing system. It wanted to have a chance to create a different constitutional order. So you can have transitional arrangements, but you can also have them conceptualized as permanent. So in the Northern Ireland case, I think my own view, which is not shared by everybody, is that the particular formulae adapted for Northern Ireland, the D'Hondt system, which is excellent, the proportionality, the veto rights. My own view is that should stay if Ireland were to federalise, that Northern Ireland would continue to need to be governed differently. And those would be the collective assurances that Irish nationalists, North and South, would offer to Ulster Unionists as part and parcel of accepting the outcome of some future majority rule. So
that's not understood down here, frankly. I mean, I didn't understand that, frankly.
It's not understood down here. It's not. You can't point to a specific feature of the text which says that. But you have to ask yourself this: if there were to be a unified Ireland, there has to be two referendums. There has to be one in the north and one in the south, and they both have to converge. So that almost certainly means they have to negotiate what that unified Ireland would look like. Now, it's not a recipe for success if, let's say, the Sinn Féin and SDLP coalition in the north says, well, actually what we'd like to do is dissolve the 6 counties into the institutional arrangements of the 1937 constitution. And incidentally, when we do that, we'll lose all our local power and we'll be governed by an elite from Dublin. So they will actually think about it themselves. Well, actually, it makes sense for Northern Ireland institutions to remain in some way because we, after all, are now a local majority there. Why should we concede all these powers? So the way it's been institutionally set up, I can't see any way in which a federal Ireland being avoided as the eventual outcome, with distinct government arrangements in the north.
What is other simple concept? How important is the lubricant money to the success of all these systems? If the British taxpayer were unable or unwilling to support Northern Ireland, would power sharing work? I think you've got to fail states fail.
Yes.
Ultimately, economically. I mean, is democracy not a successful state, or is it a precursor of success?
Well, as we can see from Iraq, that money itself doesn't solve things. The per capita, if Iraq's oil revenues since 1920 had been moderately well invested, each average Iraqi would be a lot richer than each average person on this island. So we know that money is, of itself, isn't crucial. It's the institutional apparatus that matters. If the British start to impose austerity programs on Northern Ireland, that creates lots and lots of pressures on both the DUP and Sinn Féin. It creates lots of pressure on them to blame the British government, blame each other to avoid responsibility, or to talk to themselves about whether they want more powers, whether they would like to have a different level of expenditure and different forms of tax regime. So one future way of handling a mild British economic withdrawal would be to enhance the powers of the Northern Ireland Parliament. It's only one way things would go.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting, the risk is that you say average and large party contribution, given the dependence on
Well,
public sector jobs and so on.
right, and one of the things about Northern Ireland was heading in this way anyway before the conflict, but one of the indirect consequences of the Northern Ireland conflict was to make an East European economy out of Northern Ireland. A heavy dependence on the public sector, public enterprises, and I think having a more market-oriented economy would benefit both communities. I'm not a neoliberal, but I certainly think Northern Ireland needs a more vibrant domestic economy. But that critically depends upon long-run political stability and commitment of both groups to the stability of the system. It's very interdependent.
I think we'll wrap it up there. Before we finish, I'll just note that there is tea, coffee, and even biscuits here. You're welcome to join us for a reception afterwards. And I'd like to just thank Brendan O'Leary again for such a stimulating talk. Thank you.